New Eden is a loosely bound cluster of stars, approximately 106 light-years long, 90 light-years wide, and 25 light-years thick. The cluster contains 5,433 star systems with Stargate connections, though significantly more stars and stellar remnants with no gate connections exist between. Because stargates are almost exclusively deployed in star systems with orbital bodies, every star system within New Eden has at least one planet. It similarly contains many black holes, neutron stars, and white dwarfs, but these have also been mostly left unconnected to the Stargate system. The cluster is relatively densely packed, with the average system having at least one neighbor less than a light-year away from it. It is composed of stars of all stellar classifications and ages. When looking at charted star maps, explorers often notice a filamentary structure to the cluster, especially at its edges. This leads some to believe that there are massive voids of stars within the cluster, but this is only partly true. Many of these gaps are filled with stars which have simply not been connected to the rest of the cluster through stargates. Such gaps are occasionally filled in, most recently when the Kaldari state opened several connecting gates to Black Rise. Some voids are actually devoid of stars, such as Divinity's Edge, or are in the midst of heavy stellar formation, such as with the Vapor Sea. Archaeological evidence implies human beings first visited New Eden roughly 15,000 years ago. The exact mechanism by which humans ventured into the cluster is unknown, though evidence points to the Eve Gate, located in the system from which the cluster takes its name, as the entryway. It appears these early settlers, over a period of roughly 100 years, colonized planets throughout the cluster, until a sudden disaster apparently struck them. The exact nature of this disaster is unknown, but it was catastrophic enough that within a few generations, the technology of the settlements had regressed significantly. Over the intervening centuries, the majority of the settlements died out. A few managed to survive, and slowly began to regain their lost technology. The first of these are the people who would come to be known as the Jove. The Jove are notoriously secretive, and have shared little of their history. They once inhabited the region known as Curse during their first empire. Following the contraction of a malady known as the Jovian disease, they abandoned the area in an attempt to escape the affliction. Roughly 3,000 years ago, they united into a second empire. At some other point, at least 3 other civilizations rose to power. Today, they are known mainly by the artifacts and ruins they left behind, with little knowledge of what caused them to rise and eventually vanish from the cluster's landscape. They are known as the Sleepers, the Talokan, and the Yanjung, though the recent discovery of wormhole space has provided tantalizing clues about the fates of the Sleepers and Talokan. A fourth ancient civilization, the Takmal, arose later as an offshoot of Amar exiles. The next civilization to emerge from the Dark Ages were the Amar, who had conquered their home planet. Just over 2,000 years ago, they rediscovered spaceflight and began exploring their home system. Soon after, they discovered an intact Stargate within their system and successfully reverse-engineered the technology. In 21,290 AD, they constructed the first modern Stargate and connected it to the nearby system of Hedion. Early on, the Amar drove a sect of the Sani Sabik out from their space. These exiles travelled to the then distant constellation of Araz and founded their own small empire. Unrestrained by Amar religious restrictions, these people, who came to be known as the Tak Mal, rose to great heights, only to apparently collapse under the weight of their religion. The Amar, meanwhile, slowly began exploring space, eventually coming into contact with several other surviving civilizations, beginning with the primitive Ialur in 21,432 AD. They continued to expand over the centuries, encountering and conquering the Ni Kuni 1,000 years ago, and then the Minmatar in 22,480 AD. In 23,508, they finally discovered the warp drive, enabling them to expand at a much more rapid pace. This enabled them to meet the Galente, Caldari, and Jove within a short space of time in 23,180 AD. Though the Amar judged the Galente too powerful to attempt to conquer, they believed the Jove to be vulnerable. They attacked the Jove in 23,216 AD at the Battle of Vakatioth and were soundly defeated. Shortly after, the Minmatar rebelled and cast the Empire out from their native space. The Empire spent the next several decades recovering and have adopted a more conciliatory stance towards the rest of the cluster. The Kaldari were first exposed to space by the arrival of the Galente on their planet in 22,517 AD. Shortly after, the Galente sent the Cultural Deliverance Society to the Kaldari in 22,631 AD, with the aim of advancing the Kaldari technologically. The Kaldari exploited this opportunity to the fullest, expanding out into space under the aegis of the Galente. In collaboration with the Galente, the Kaldari developed the first modern warp drive in the cluster in 22,821 AD. This enabled the Kaldari to expand rapidly outside of the view of the Galente. The Kaldari, finding the cultural imperialism of the Galente oppressive, kept their colonies secret. Their eventual discovery in 23,155 AD led to the outbreak of the Galente Caldari War. The Kaldari were forced to flee their homeworld and founded an independent state in their own sector of space. The two sides fought to a protracted draw, with each side gaining temporary advantages, only to see them eventually vanish. The Kaldari developed fighters, only for the Galente to counter with drone technology. The Kaldari then gained the capsule from the Jove, while both nations developed the Titan. The two sides fought the second largest battle in history at the Battle of Ian Usta, which inflicted heavy casualties to both. After nearly a century of conflict, both sides had become exhausted by the simmering war. They eventually signed a peace treaty in 23,248 AD. The Galente managed to discover the Kaldari in 22,463 AD, but were unable to contact them, spurring their development of space exploration. They finally managed to establish contact in 22,517 AD. Soon after, they developed and constructed their first Stargate. Unlike the Amar, they did not have an intact Stargate to study, leading to a different design. The Galente eagerly expanded, driven by curiosity and a thirst for knowledge. 200 years later, they discovered the Intaki, and soon after discovered the Manar in 22,809 AD. Much like with the Kaldari, the Galente uplifted these civilizations with technology, bringing them into the spacefaring fold. With help from the Kaldari, the Galente developed the first modern warp drive in 22,821 AD, greatly increasing their ability to explore. With more and more systems being discovered and colonized, the Galente founded the Federation, along with the Kaldari, Intaki, and Manar. In 23,155 AD, the Galente discovered several secret Kaldari colonies. Because the colonies had not been established according to Federation law, the Galente attempted to penalize the Kaldari. This eventually escalated, with the Kaldari withdrawing from the Federation. A Kaldari terrorist cell sabotaged the dome of an underwater Galente city, Nouvelle Rouvenor, killing 500,000 people. A fascist government took power in the Federation following the attack, which began military operations against the Kaldari. As the Kaldari evacuated their homeworld, the Federation planned a large assault on the planet. In order to delay them, a detachment of the Kaldari fleet attacked the Federation Navy and engaged in hit-and-run strikes. When the fleet was too damaged to continue, they ran one last suicide mission, crashing their carrier into Galente Prime, an act which killed 2 million people in the city of Huermont. The Minmatar discovered spaceflight in 21,413 AD, and spent the next several centuries exploring and colonizing. Unlike the other races, they did not construct their own stargates. Instead, they found several still working gates and used them to expand across 3 systems. They also developed a unique form of faster-than-light travel that was only later copied by the other races, the acceleration gate. The Minmatar spent the next several centuries living in peace and prosperity. Unlike the other nations, they felt no need to expand beyond their limited reach. This proved to be to their detriment, as the Amar discovered them and invaded in 22,355 AD. Technologically superior to the Minmatar, the Amar were able to cripple the Minmatar defenses, and enslaved millions in an event known as the Day of Darkness. Over the following centuries, the majority of the Minmatar would be enslaved by the Empire. It wasn't until 800 years later that the Minmatar were able to rebel against the Amar and regain their freedom. This required the assistance of the Galente and a fortuitous Amar defeat in the Battle of Vakatioth. However, the Minmatar were able to drive the Amar out of their home space and take additional territory on top of that, giving them a strong foundation from which to rebuild their culture. In 23,230 AD, the 5 empires came together and founded Concord as an interstellar peacekeeping organization. Concord brokered peace treaties between the Galente and Kaldari, putting an end to their nearly century-long war, and the Amar and Minmatar, freeing the Republic from the immediate fear of invasion and re-enslavement. 6 years later, Concord hosted the Yoyul Conference, which established Eve's Standard Time. An unsteady peace embraced the cluster, only being briefly broken by the rise and destruction of Sansh's nation. This peace continued for over a century. In YC 105, a technological breakthrough married the capsule to cloning technology. This led to an explosion in capsuleers across New Eden, launching a new era into the cluster. Capsuleers quickly grew in power and influence, and soon became celebrities and idols to the ordinary people of the cluster, known as baseliners. Capsuleers brought untold violence, though the empires utilized them to their own ends as well. The Capsuleers began to expand and colonize the unclaimed regions of the cluster, building up their own small empires in the void. These empires rose and fell with alarming speed, with only a few managing to hold on to some form of stability and longevity. The empires created their own violence in YC 110, when the Kaldari attacked the Federation and occupied Kaldari Prime, and the Minmatar elders assaulted the Amar Empire in an attempt to free their remaining enslaved brethren. In response, the empires empowered Capsuleers to join militias and fight on their behalf, under the Concord Emergency Militia War Powers Act. Since then, the entire cluster has been engaged in war.